Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today's video is something of a sequel to a previous video of mine, Make Your Fantasy Races Distinct. In it, I went over several archetypes that are often used to make fantasy races, or science fiction species, unique from each other and distinct from humans. Mostly, though, I was concerned with the role they would fill within a story or a setting. But then that's not the only way you can classify sapient non-humans. There are also a lot of physical characteristics that can separate fantasy races, characteristics that can give non-humans different abilities or mentalities that diverge from a real-life human. And so that's just what I'm going to examine in today's video. Now I'd like to make one quick note before we start, and that's the fact that these attributes can be used just as easily in a science fiction setting as in a fantasy setting. The only reason I put fantasy races in the title again is because it got the first video a lot of views. And hey, who am I to argue with the YouTube algorithm? But let's get started. Number 1. Beastly Attributes. This idea is so obvious that it predates the fantasy genre by thousands of years. In ancient Greece, they were replacing the heads of horses with the bodies of humans. And in ancient Egypt, they were replacing the heads of humans with the heads of owls, jackals, and cats. Humans have an inherent desire to personify the creatures and the forces of nature around them, and as such, it's very easy to imagine both plants and animals with humanoid shapes and humanoid intelligences. With that in mind, it's also quite easy to imagine a fantasy setting that forgoes the usual elves, dwarves, and orcs, and instead has all non-human races be different kinds of humanoid animals, like cats, dogs, wolves, ducks, rats, and turtles. For instance, the base version of Dungeons & Dragons has a traditional set of player races, but between all the expansions and the unusual settings, you can also encounter or play as snake people, elephant people, turtle people, cat people, fish people, shark people, praying mantis people, hippo people, lizard people, bird people, and lion people. And all of that is just from the official books for the current edition. The biggest advantage to using animal features for your races are that it's very easy to distinguish them from one another, and it also gives you some built-in ideas for cultural stereotypes. Cat folk could be aloof yet curious. Dog folk could be loyal to their friends but vicious to their enemies. Lizard folk could be unemotional and slow to act. And bird folk could be nomadic and opportunistic. The big downside to using animal features is that it can stretch credulity if you're trying to construct a more realistic setting. After all, it would be a massive coincidence if every alien species in your science fiction setting just so happens to resemble humanoid versions of Earth animals. But of course, if you're not going for realism, you really don't need to worry about that. Number 2. Unusual diets. Humans have a fairly unrestricted diet compared to most other animals. We can and do eat a wide variety of plant and animal products, including substances that other species consider poisonous or distasteful. Did you know that garlic smells like that as a way to keep burrowing and digging animals from taking a second bite? And the reason peppers taste hot is to try and get humans and other mammals to stop eating them. Still, there are some restrictions that we can't avoid. A little ethanol will get you drunk, but too much will kill you. Certain kinds of plant fibers are indigestible, and chemicals like bleach are so caustic that nothing on Earth can metabolize it. But what if a fantasy race needed a chemical that we considered dangerous, the way that we need certain vitamins? Or what if something like vitamin C was deadly to them, or else worked as a powerful hallucinogen? What if their diet was more restricted than ours? Or what if they survived on something completely different, like sunlight or geothermal heat? A lot of the human mindset revolves around food, probably more of it than you'd think. We worry about having enough food for ourselves and our kids, about cooking and eating good food, about eating snacks to pass the time, and about ingesting alcohol and other drugs to modify our mood. We get irritable when we're hungry, we'll eat anything if we're desperate, and one of the best ways to socialize the world over is to enjoy a meal together. So when you choose an unusual diet for a fantasy or science fiction species, that one decision can lead to a lot of other differences between that species and humans. Number 3. alien mindsets. This is one of the most essential but also most difficult ways to distinguish humans from non-humans. The fact is that humans are the only sapient species on planet Earth, and the only ones we've ever encountered. And while foreign cultures can sometimes seem alien and unnatural, the fact is that there are a few values that all human cultures share in common. Unjustified murder is bad, stealing from friends is bad, slavery is something that should happen to other people, or not at all, and things always work out better when people work together. But because we have a sample size of 1, we have no idea how much of this supposedly universal mindset is required for sapience, and how much of it we just happen to have on top of being sapient. What if there was a species so fatalistic and so fertile that death and murder meant nothing to them? What if a species was so communally minded that service was its own reward and individual accomplishments were meaningless? What if we developed a sapient artificial intelligence, but it had no sense of pride, no self-preservation instinct, no need to love or be loved, and no concept of boredom? Inventing and then expressing a truly alien mindset is one of the hardest things you can do as an author. So there is no shame in making things easy on yourself by sticking with a human baseline for your fantasy races. Many famous authors either avoid the topic altogether or else use cheats, like having a truly alien race perform seemingly random actions without bothering to explain why. So if the alien mindset seems too difficult to use, don't worry, you're not alone, and you can make a perfectly good setting where all the non-human races are still essentially human. Number 4. Environmental preferences. Humans are very adaptable creatures. We can survive perfectly well in a variety of different environments, and once we reach our limits, we can adapt our environments to suit ourselves. Ultimately, though, our bodies are best suited to the African plains from whence we came. Our legs are suited to walking and running long distances, our skin sweats to dissipate heat, and when the temperature goes down, we have to put on extra clothing layers to survive. But what if other fantasy races were better suited to other environments? If elves were really suited to living in forest canopies, they would have longer arms and more flexible feet, both of which would help them grab tree branches and stay off the ground. If dwarves were really suited to living underground, they would have completely white skin, non-functional eyes, and a much thinner body, since calories are harder to come by underground. Or, to go at it from the other direction, a moose person would be fine with cold temperatures, but have trouble with the unrelenting heat and dryness of a desert, and a camel person would be just as uncomfortable in a frozen forest. A species from a heavier world would be stocky and strong compared to one from a lighter world, but it would also suffer from bone and muscle atrophy if it stayed on the lighter world for too long. A species from a lighter world would be relatively fast and nimble, but it would also suffer from easily broken bones and long-term heart conditions. The list of examples just keeps going from there, so I'm sure you can think of more of them on your own. Number 5. Size differences. In general, humans tend to think of larger things as being imposing, aggressive, strong, and confident. We therefore think of smaller things as being meek, passive, weak, and insecure. Thus, when a fantasy race is noticeably bigger or smaller than a human, they very often take on one or more of those qualities as a collective. For instance, orcs are generally depicted as being stronger and more aggressive than humans, which means they are also physically larger. Traditional goblins are just as vicious as orcs, but because they're smaller, they act out their viciousness by being sneaky and using underhanded tactics like traps and overwhelming numbers. Elves are often depicted as being both taller and more self-assured than humans, and halflings, or hobbits, are shorter than humans and much more content with a quiet life of country living. However, there are two things you should keep in mind about the connection between size and personality. First, size and personality have very little to do with each other. A tall man might feel more confident because of his height, but that confidence would vanish if he moved to a city where everyone was as tall as him. Second, this assignment of personality traits assumes that humans are the standard for size measurement. But what if, in your setting, humans were the shortest or tallest of all the known races? Number 6. Unusual reproduction methods. I mentioned earlier that humans care a lot about food. Well, the parts of us that don't care about food care about love, sex, raising children, and otherwise passing on our wisdom to the next generation. And all of that is ultimately because of how we reproduce and how much time it takes for our children to grow up. So what would we be like if we had some other means of reproducing? There are a variety of reproduction methods in nature, after all. Many plants can pollinate themselves or each other with equal ease, assuming they have some outside help. Other plants send out shoots and start new sets of roots and leaves, and while they're all part of the same organism, each of them could potentially survive on their own. Corals and sponges reproduce by budding, fungi reproduce by releasing spores, and certain animal species can fully reproduce asexually. A sapient race with no need for sexual partners would potentially have no need for sexual attraction or romantic love, which would give it a very different set of foundational needs. Or you could go the other way and create a race that has 3 or 4 sexes, all of which are needed for reproduction. That sort of division would create a very interesting family dynamic, especially if each sex had its own set of physical and mental characteristics. Number 7. A non-physical existence. Now, who says that a speculative fiction race has to inhabit a physical body? Certainly not a lot of speculative fiction authors. Maybe there's a race out there in your setting that came from a different dimension and inhabits the bodies of a species in this dimension. Or else they form a kind of cross-dimensional symbiosis with that species. Or maybe an ancient race managed to separate their souls from their bodies and have been watching and guiding the younger species ever since. Something else you could do is create a semi-physical entity, like a sentient gas cloud, or an AI that can freely move between computer systems, or a planet-sized collective intelligence that uses all the plant or fungal life across its surface the way that the human brain uses individual neurons. A non-physical or semi-physical entity would have very little reason to fear for its own existence, or worry about other basic needs like food or reproduction, and as such, it would have a very different perspective on life than our own. Despite all of the differences we imagine in one another, humans are a very homogeneous species. As such, by taking a few steps beyond human physiology, you can open up a lot of different ideas and concepts that a race close to human in biology would be unable to explore. So when you create a list of non-human races for your setting, don't be afraid to throw a few curveballs. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.